future of the Lord of the Rings production was on the line.
The realization came to everyone that New Line could go under.
What do we do now?
The idea was to do a huge press event in Cannes and then this huge party to pre-sell the international distribution rights.
Everything hinged on an epic 20-minute sequence in the mines of Moria that had been shot in just 7 days.
They wanted to really show the world how Lord of the Rings was gonna look on screen, that this film was gonna be something really exciting.
And then say, you know, you can have the films, but you gotta give us money up front, and you have to book all 3 films.
New Line's fate now rested in the hands of Weta's post-production.
There were time constraints.
It was very short order.
You've only got one chance to get it right.
But even with the dark cloud of dwindling funds hanging over them, and key cast and crew now on the French Riviera,
We didn't stop filming. If we don't succeed, it won't be because we haven't put every last ounce of energy into this.
through accidents,
Sean got like 16 or 20 stitches.
a director hell-bent on achieving his vision.
Cast had got bigger, the crew had got bigger.
Production was already sailing uncharted waters.
3 films.
3 films.
3 films at once.
Don't you see this madness?
There was always going to be a lot of anxiety.
Now, with the release of The Fellowship of the Ring only 7 months away and a shaky financial future, would Peter Jackson's epic become just another failed film project?
A just question, my liege.
In Wellington, New Zealand, the clock was ticking for Weta Digital. Time was fast running out to complete the Mines of Moria sequence to the standard required before its screening.
We couldn't show anything that had green screen because we all know that film reviewers can't look at green screen and understand what that shot's supposed to be.
To bring the Mines of Moria to life in such a short time would require a large, cave troll-sized effort. But within it,
Peter saw an opportunity. What happens often in visual effects is the visual effects team want as much time as they can for R&D, and they don't really want to get into starting to do shots until they feel confident and feel they won't be embarrassed. So he used this as a tool to force them to get into production.
and then, with the sequence almost completed, a last-minute suggestion from an unlikely source made the schedule even tighter.
One of the assistant editors, a guy named Peter Scarrett, who I really admire quite a bit, he came to me and said, you know, this is great, but there's a problem because you haven't introduced the characters. Introduce the characters before we see the cave troll sequence, and you haven't given us a lead out where this is going, like a teaser that gives us some sense of what the shape of the movie is going to be. So Peter added those two. He took the suggestion, added that.
Added were scenes setting up the Shire and the Hobbits, along with some of the principal villains, and, of course, heroes, along with snippets of Two Towers and Return of the King, and a few battle scenes thrown in for good measure.
They made it in time for Canne. It was really great.
They packed it up in the most secure package they could find, Dean Lyon's Carry On.
So I carried a hard drive to France. It wasn't like something we could send. It was way too important.
With the airmail safely delivered,
Everything was riding on this.
the real work began.
Bob Shea took a gigantic risk.
Peter hadn't done anything of this magnitude. There wasn't a huge movie star in the film. We had distributors from Europe, from Asia, Australia, from all over.
Half the Shire's been invited.
And what we were asking very upfront, a lot of money. Even if the first one didn't work, they still had to pay for the other two.
So, on May the 11th, 2001, distributors and the worldwide press sat down to decide the fate of Lord of the Rings.
And that room full of people lost their minds.
People went nuts.
I get the chills right now even remembering that. It was brilliant.
You work very hard on something, you're not quite sure how it's going to look. It was a pretty exciting moment for all of us that were able to see that footage. I thought, wow, this is going to blow people's minds. I've never seen anything like this.
The Mines of Moria sequence in particular had people begging for more. A lot more.
That whole sequence is so much of the essence of what this franchise is about. It looks beautiful, it's intense, it's emotional.
What they did in that room was they blew everybody's mind. In the middle of the Cannes Film Festival, where you're there to see high-minded art from around the world by the greatest filmmakers working, 20 minutes of Lord of the Rings stole the oxygen from that entire festival.
The thing that at least my friends were talking about were, this looks exactly like I imagined it. This looks exactly the way it was described in the book.
You work very hard on something, you're not quite sure how it's going to look. And getting to see that footage was an eye-opener. I think we realized that we were part of something that was at a higher level of anything that we'd done before.
I decided to sneak into the theater and just sit down anonymously behind 3 British reporters. One of them turned to the other one and said, gee, I thought Tolkien was going to be boring. And I knew then that we had a film that was working really, really well.
But perhaps no one was quite as elated as the foreign distributors.
Distributors came out with tears. I remember, I think it was Samuel Hadida went up to Mark Rudetsky and like grabbed him and started kissing him. I mean, they were just thrilled and just stunned at what that they had seen and the potential of the film.
And after several successful screenings, they packed it up and went home.
No, you don't.
Just kidding.
They had a huge party afterwards.
Basically reconstructed the Shire, everything. It was phenomenal. There had never been anything like this. To really introduce these films as something spectacular.
Yeah, it was exciting.
It's a great party at Cannes, lots of people. I'm sure New Line spent a lot of money on it.
$2 million, to be precise.
All the cast were there. A lot of the key crew were there.
Even Peter Jackson got all dolled up and put on a nice suit.
But he refused to put on shoes. And we're like, Peter, at least put on sandals or something.
But with shoes on or off, New Line could feel a bit of a spring in Peter's step.
They realized that Peter was a true auteur, and the team around him were delivering something that was going to be a lot more than what they imagined.
With everyone drunk on Hobbit ale and Elvish wine, New Line's sales department got to work.
We did it. We did it successfully.
And by the end of Cannes, New Line had closed all the foreign pre-sales.
And with that, the party could truly begin. For some, though, the victories were more than financial.
These were really male films. The deals we negotiated were mostly all with men. And I was very, very proud to be a woman representing this. My team had a lot of really strong women, and I'm really proud to have been a part of it. Yeah.
And there was a lot to be proud of.
And I truly think once Cannes happened, that's the moment that everybody exhales for the first time.
That was good.
It was maybe the biggest moment of hype I've ever witnessed, and deservedly.
That was so successful that everything changed.
With the newly earned hype, the relationship between Peter and New Line changed as well.
I know that there were worries about the budget blowing out, that, you know, the cast had got bigger, the crew had got bigger, more was being spent. I think there was an assurance after that footage at Cannes that this was going to be worth the money that they were spending.
Arriving back in New Zealand, Peter Jackson and his team got back to work, albeit with a strong wind in their sails.
The floodgates opened, you know, but it didn't feel like a completely different movie. Peter knew what he was doing, and he didn't even if they gave him 3 times the money, he wasn't going to turn it into something else all of a sudden. You know, I think he knew he'd found the right language for the film before they got the cash injection.
But a lot of the pressure was taken off of us.
But not all the pressure.
We knew we had to have it finished for December that year.
With 6 months till the end of the year, production kicked it up into high gear.
At one point we had like 4 or 5 units shooting on to the 2 islands, and it was like at one point we had 4 Orlando shooting simultaneously on 4 different parts of the island.
And if you're wondering how that was possible...
We had so many Orlando doubles. Well, I think we had 7.
All of which would soon become very necessary.
We were filming and we had nearly finished the sequence, but one of the shots that we had left was acrobatic of mounting onto the horse.
And he fell off the horse. He fell badly, and I think he fell onto some hard rocks. And they were all very concerned that he'd damaged his spine.
Orlando was quickly rushed to the local hospital.
But he was fine. He was out the next day, and he was very sore, but that was it.
Well, lad, whatever luck you'll live by, let's hope it lasts the night.
And the production breathed a sigh of relief, having avoided what could have been a very costly mistake.
Peter's very good. He says, "Okay, quick, get Orlando double ready. Who's doing it today? You know, nothing's going to stop us filming. Just have to adjust what we are filming."
Even if the injuries were starting to pile up.
I was leaning over them and saying,
"Squeal! No one's going to save you now."
And I had this sword, which were real, and I kind of donged him on the head with it. He's sort of bleeding just very slightly. You know, then a few days later we're doing that scene and I get kicked in the face.
Similar thing, they were trying to find Merry and Pippin, and they came upon this encampment where the Uruk-hai were, and Aragorn thought that they were dead. So he kicked a helmet, and he broke his toe, kicking the helmet, which is in the movie, and he kept on going. He didn't let that stop him, and it probably added to his performance, but I know it was very painful.
It was an absolute marathon of energy and draining long days and long nights.
Keep breathing. That's the key.
There was this sense of we can't afford to fail. We've been given this opportunity to film one of the most amazing pieces of literature, and it's our responsibility to do everything we can to make it a success.
The Lord of the Rings production schedule was relentless. Never before had a studio committed to shooting a complete trilogy in one straight run.
It was a massive logistical challenge. 266 main unit principal photography days for 3 movies, but we did have the luxury of numerous units running at times, you know, second units, a second unit, blue screen units, miniature units.
But no one was more embedded than Peter Jackson.
There were days Peter would sit at a monitor and he'd call cut on main unit. He'd look directly across to another monitor, which was a feed from second unit, and pick up the phone and make performance notes, continuity notes, whatever it might be. He had his head around things like I've never seen anyone juggle prior to or previously, I don't think.
With the Fellowship of the Ring's release date rapidly approaching, it was time for Jackson to narrow his focus.
The hour is later than you think.
Lord of the Rings, we always talk about it, they made all the films together. It's sort of a misnomer. There was an extended process by which all 3 of those films were made. But at a certain point, they narrowed everyone's interest to Fellowship of the Ring, because it became very clear. This is all ambitious, this is all great, but we have a movie that has to be in theaters, Christmas of 2001, and it has to work, and we're terrified.
So Peter focused his attention on the first film, The Fellowship of the Ring.
It was important to everyone that the first film worked, and he put most of his energy into that.
But his many second units kept chugging away at the latter 2 films.
He had second unit directors working on Helm's Deep, for example.
The enormity of the battle certainly got my attention.
John Mahaffey was now in charge of the biggest battle scene in the history of cinema, an intimidating prospect.
Friends are with you, Aragorn.
The main gaffer, Brian Bansgrove, who was legendary, said, "This one's going to sort out the men from the boys, and I intend to finish it a man."
It's kind of legendary in the New Zealand film industry now for just the worst, most difficult, impossible shoot that anyone's ever done.
And while there were many reasons for this, the first was simply the sheer number of people needed.
We had 200 extras that we could get in close to.
That's 200 extras that would serve as the models for the 10,000 orcs.
We hadn't really had those sort of numbers of extras in New Zealand before, so just things like, when do we give them the swords? When do we put the masks on them?
And unfortunately for Matt, he was the one tasked with figuring it out.
I was in charge of the orc army, getting them dressed into their armour and come up with different looks. In fact, the prosthetics guys would say to me, this is kind of a hillbilly orc, or this is kind of a rock and roll guy, which was kind of fun.
Which leads to the second reason why this was such a long, arduous shoot.
The stunt players, they'd be there in their rubber suit, heads on. We could film for 15, 20 minutes. If we didn't stop at that point and take their heads off, some of them would actually expire through lack of oxygen.
And with the battle taking place in the rain, it was untenable to constantly douse the orcs in water.
To keep them looking wet and really wet, there were literally buckets of KY jelly. So, I mean, everyone got over the jokes very quickly, but you just slop it on and it stays wet.
The result was a mosh pit of extras, covered in latex and lube.
It was a lot of what we call organised chaos.
Because the actual battle scene is chaotic and accidents galore.
And no one would know this better than stuntman Sala Baker, who portrayed many of the Uruk-hai.
Sala Baker, he got hit by one of the horses, and I think we measured he flew through the air 20 feet before he hit the ground again.
With so many swords and weapons, even the principal cast were bound to get hit.
Vigo was sword fighting, and the stunt guy hit Vigo right across the mouth and broke a tooth. And the tooth fell out into the mud and muck of the set, and Vigo just picked it up.
And walked right over to the special effects department to see if
we could just super glue it back on.
While they said no to the super glue, they did offer to send him to a dentist.
He said, no, I'm going to keep going. I don't have to go to the dentist.
The Battle of Helm's Deep was turning into an extreme sport.
I said to Peter at one point, when Legolas is trying to rescue Gimli, why doesn't he throw a shield on the ground and ride it down the stairs like a snowboard?
Executed to perfection by stuntman Morgan Evans.
And if ever I mentioned someone, oh yeah, I was double for Legolas in those movies, that's the scene they remember, because it was just so cool, so slick.
John's unorthodox inspiration continued while observing the Uruk-hai performers between takes.
These guys that looked like big, ugly Uruk-hai with their hats off, they were like a football team or, for us in New Zealand, a rugby team that were committed to get across the line.
But with the constant start and stop of production, the team had to find ways to stay awake during the long nights.
The boys would stand around and one of them would sing, and then they would be starting to dance in these suits that I said to Peter, why don't we do like the Maori haka, which is a war challenge.
Often performed before matches by the New Zealand national rugby team.
And so that came in as they started the chant that built up to the moment of their charging.
This clever addition, along with several other punch-ups and rewrites, was the third reason why filming the epic battle took so long.
There's 2 towers footage that you can see that they shot with Arwen at the Battle of Helm's Deep.
The remnants of an early script which featured the Elvish princess more prominently.
She was supposed to come and fight as well.
Because, if you recall, she was supposed to be
a female warrior.
But they took that out because it just kind of didn't make sense from a narrative point of view. So they decided to replace her with Haldir.
Not just Haldir, but a whole battalion of elves.
We are proud to fight alongside men once more.
Meanwhile, the changes only extended production on the battle.
We filmed there for a long, long time, all nights.
And you were just basically, waiting until the sun came up and then you could pretty much go home.
Fatigue began to cast its long shadow over the production.
After about a couple of months, I'd go in and people were weird, in a funny mood, because they weren't seeing any daylight. We had one person out there who was threatening to jump off the sets, suicide attempt.
One of the crew became disorientated and climbed inside the tower.
Which, while only a miniature, was still 40 feet tall.
Fortunately, we were able to assure him and get him down for help and diffuse a situation that could have literally been tragic. It kind of impressed upon all of us that we needed to look out for each other, that we needed to be able to be honest with each other about the pressures that people were experiencing.
With a renewed sense of brotherhood, filming continued, but there was trouble ahead. The epic Battle of Helm's Deep had pushed John Mahaffey's second unit to the brink.
We'd be in a studio, and in the first day, go, and that's the rap on Helm's Deep, and then we'd be doing another studio, and that's the rap on Helm's Deep, and by the third time it's like, yeah, really? Are you sure we're wrapped, or are we going to do something else?
But the war was far from over, and new challenges emerged with each and every scene.
This particular day, we were to film this sequence at Minas Tirith. And my Steadicam operator was away at a dental appointment.
And not wanting to lose the day,
I put on the Steadicam. So we roll camera and I say action, and I'm sort of running backwards through this market, and Peter comes round onto our set. He says, that's great, let's do this one, we'll try this. And so we do another take. He goes, oh, that's great, let's do another one, we'll try this. And it was like 15 takes later, and I'm going, ah.
It was becoming apparent that to film this epic story, it would require total commitment.
I got to do some of the training with a horse called Brownie for the scene where the horse sits down on Vigo and lets him get on. It was a scene that I think Peter was a bit dubious about doing. He didn't want his horse to sit down on his lead actor's face.
Thankfully, his leading man was up for the challenge.
He would come out after work to ride the horse, to feed the horse, to groom the horse. He totally believed that if you were going to bond with a horse, you should spend as much time as possible.
That was Vigo. He would live in the field with the horse. He and the horse were as one. But it took him months. He is incredibly dedicated.
Then we shot there on the day, and it was kind of, the horse did it perfectly. He's kind of almost like a horse whisperer.
While the horses could be tamed, the same couldn't be said for the weather.
We were shooting in a place called Skipper's Canyon. It was the scene where Arwen is on one side of the river and the Nazgul are on the other. And we'd filmed the day before, and then there was an unseasonable fall of snow that night. It started snowing very, very hard, and we knew that we had to keep filming with those horses at another location, so we literally had to ride them out of there. Otherwise, they would have got us stuck in there for days.
With the weather closing in on one side and a 400-foot drop into the canyon on the other, the team of wranglers had to work together to get out alive.
I couldn't see the horse in front of me. The blizzard was kind of, the snow was coming straight into our faces, so that was a moment where we really had to trust both ourselves and our mount to get out safely, yeah.
But to be honest, each location tested the ingenuity and resilience of the New Zealand crew, including the sleepy town of Twizel.
That whole area in the South Island was inhabited by, millions upon millions of rabbits once upon a time.
And fuzzy rabbits make fuzzy rabbit homes.
And each time we galloped, horses would stumble into these rabbit holes. And we had hundreds of people with sandbags filling in these rabbit holes in between takes to make it safe for the 300 horses to gallop on.
And shooting in the north was potentially equally catastrophic.
It was an open desert in the middle of the North Island.
A perfect location for the Mordor sets. Well, except for the one explosive detail.
There was mines underground.
Luckily, the nearby military base offered their support.
So we're gonna have to be on set to kind of help you out. And then it was also turned into, well, you guys are military. You guys march. You guys want to just be Gondor's army for this scene right here? That'd be great.
So, like many New Zealanders, they too decided to pitch in. And while the horses survived the rabbit holes and the military survived the minefield, one hobbit couldn't make it past the sandy beach.
Sean got like 16 or 20 stitches, quite a bad cut.
when an errant stick pierced the hobbit through his oversized feet.
So I had to cut the bottom of the foot off. This blob of clear plasma dropped, and then Elijah came over with a stick and started poking it.
Sean would make a full recovery, and thankfully, he wouldn't have to get wet again.
He could not or would not go in the water.
So green screen DP Nigel Bluck was tasked with the impossible.
I remember getting that call. Oh, can you figure out a way to shoot dry for wet? No, I had no idea, none. But I do have a good knowledge about water and being in water. I've grown up around that, so I just sort of broke it down and figured out, well, I did it. We just shot at very high speed, used a lot of wind to make his skin move as it should, put his cape on wires. It was, you know, very simple.
Once again, proving the ingenuity and resilience of the Lord of the Rings crew.
Bare bones, we made things up, we built things to do things, we did things in very basic ways sometimes, and they worked.
If production on Lord of the Rings was a logistical nightmare, then post-production was sure to be no easier.
Unlike all things on this film, it was complicated in the sense that Peter had a great idea. He was going to have 3 editors.
John Gilbert, editing Fellowship of the Ring. Michael J. Horton, editing Two Towers. And Jamie Selkirk, editing Return of the King.
And that he would be able to go from one cutting room to another on all 3 films, and he could get it all done in a year, but that was not possible.
So with a rapidly approaching deadline, Peter Jackson was forced to pivot.
So we did have 3 editors, and they were cutting during production, but he couldn't physically and mentally be so engaged in all 3 films at the same time.
But given the scope of Peter Jackson's vision, New Line had doubts whether he could even deliver the first film on time. Lord of the Rings director Peter Jackson wasn't the only one struggling to juggle 3 mammoth films at once.
I tried to ignore the other 2 movies.
Editor John Gilbert had to keep his blinkers on.
I saw my movie as a complete article all on its own, and I tried not to think about the other 2.
I was barely involved.
Adding to the complications was the shift from film to digital.
Peter had a regular editor, Jamie Selkirk, he'd worked with a lot, and he was used to editing on film, but I'd been working on Avid for maybe 4 years, I suppose, by then.
So John was hired for his expertise with this new software, Avid, that was revolutionizing the film industry and allowing post teams to edit faster.
I mean, it's an incredibly elaborate task making a film like this.
Peter Jackson's high shooting rate meant there was almost an infinite amount of choices.
Some days I would get so much footage just to view it all and then try and construct a sequence out of it and then be ready for the next day's footage was quite daunting.
More than 6 million feet of film would be shot for the trilogy, which is how John ended up with a 4-hour rough cut.
The film was quite long.
Too long. And there was only one thing for that.
I was concerned about the length at times, and I would try and find things I thought that I could take aside and say, this will be good for the DVD extras. It was a way of saying, all is not lost. Because some of them had expensive visual effects work done, and there comes a commitment to them being in the film once they're sort of so extensively worked on.
Nevertheless, fitting the whole scope of Tolkien's Middle-earth into the first film was a lot of responsibility.
I didn't really care about the fans, to be honest. I just wanted the film to work as its own entity and to make sense. I didn't want you to have to know the books to enjoy the film.
So John made sure audiences never lost focus on the main character's journey.
The audience has to run with Frodo.
If the narrative wasn't talking about Frodo or the ring, it had to be cut.
I will take the ring to Mordor.
He's a little guy who takes on this huge mission, and I wanted the audience to really empathize with him taking it on and see his act of courage for what it was.
And while Frodo's sacrifice was something all audiences could relate to, John and Peter struggled with how to properly drop audiences into Middle-earth.
It began with the forging of the Great Rings.
Eventually, having Philippa Boyens write a near 7-minute long prologue.
That was a real struggle, trying to find the rhythm of it, the weight of the various elements.
9 rings were gifted to the race of men.
And there was a lot of different elements to it, so it was shot very piecemeal.
The prologue was something that took shape over several different iterations of this. Is necessary, I think, in order to drop the world in
the fires of Mount Doom.
But it's also a big ask. You're asking an audience to absorb this massive amount of material up front, and you're gambling that the normies, the people that aren't already Lord of the Rings fanatics, aren't going to be absolutely baffled by what you're throwing at them.
It was so important. We sort of fiddled with it for a long time to make sure that it was just right.
Because while it may be hard to believe, there were plenty of folks back then that were unfamiliar with what a hobbit was. And so Peter Jackson figured he could hook uninitiated audiences with one thing.
Peter wanted there to be something epic right from the start, rather than we have to wait for the third film to see the big battles. It's like, let's put a big battle right at the start. We had elves and orcs and men all fighting together in this big battle.
Die-hard fans, on the other hand, would need something a little more tantalizing.
We had very few Gollum shots in the first film.
So they made sure to include him in the prologue.
A tease of him, because obviously they were working on the digital Gollum right until the very end.
The prologue also meant the trilogy would need to establish its storyteller, the voice of the film. But who should that be? At first, it was going to be Frodo. Then they considered Gandalf.
Oh, if you can have anyone do a voiceover, anyone do narration, just let Cate Blanchett do all of it.
Unfortunately, the late call on narrator meant a late call to Sydney.
Peter and Frank couldn't go.
So they asked Barry to supervise.
I was tapped in by phone.
And while the Australian actress recorded her lines from afar, she definitely didn't phone it in.
The world is changed. I feel it in the water.
I remember it was breathtaking. I was just blown away. Take one was perfect.
But without Peter and Fran's feedback, Kate wasn't convinced.
She said, well, I'd really like to know what they think. And thankfully, Fran became available and got on the phone with her. And Fran said, oh, that's perfect, because it was perfect.
But what wasn't perfect yet was the end of the Fellowship of the Ring, which presented a challenge.
It became absolutely important to them to find a note that they could leave Fellowship of the Ring on that felt hopeful, that still felt like, yes, there's more story, but this story is done.
With post-production on Fellowship of the Ring in full gear, Peter Jackson was still looking to create a satisfying end that would also serve as a beginning for Part 2.
The Two Towers.
And it became very tricky, and it was a moving target that changed several times, even during production.
One thing that Philippa, Fran, and Peter could agree on was the need to have a death before the ending.
You fought bravely.
Eventually, they settle on the death of Boromir. They settle on that moment.
It is over.
In the novel, the death of Boromir takes place at the beginning of the Two Towers. And by moving it up to the end of the Fellowship of the Ring, it gave the film an emotional climax.
And Peter shot a lot of film for Sean Bean's death scene. He had some particular ideas about how it would go together. Some quite impressionistic kind of moments in there, with him fighting on manfully while he's got all these arrows stuck in him. And Viggo running to him and them having their little piece of dialogue at the end.
They took the little one's face down.
And I cut the scene.
I would have followed you, my brother.
I heard a couple of weeks later that Peter was very pleased with what I did, so we didn't go back and mess with it too much.
Well, as they say, you don't mess with perfection. But one thing that was messed with was the film's finale.
At the end of the day, it was Frodo's story, so they wanted to end it on Frodo instead of Aragorn.
A New Line insisted on a big action moment for him. In fact, they insisted on this.
Frodo and Sam are in the water heading across to the other side when all of a sudden the Uruk-hai pop out of the water and then they drag Mr. Frodo under and they wrestle with him in the water when the ring falls off his neck and starts floating down to the bottom. The Uruk-hai, infatuated with the ring, swim after it, but then drown. So then Sam can pull Mr. Frodo out of the water, and hooray, he's saved. And then they take a big breath, they go down and get the ring, they come back up, they get in the boat, they travel to the other side. Bada bing, bada boom, they're out.
And so was that scene. Because Peter wanted an emotional ending, rather than a Hollywood action scene.
If you end a film where someone is thinking, like, I can stop now, it'd be better for me if I stop now.
I wish the ring had never come to me.
But I won't. That's the moment where everyone knows that moment. Everyone knows the moment they didn't take that step. Everyone knows the moment they did take that step. I think that that's a really powerful thing for people.
Go back, Sam!
Peter eventually convinced New Line he was right.
He will persevere until he's got exactly what he wants. He's willing to go through whatever it takes to make the film as good as it can be. Sam nearly drowning was a difficult scene. You had to empathize with Frodo and feel for his courage. That was the key to the end of the story for me.
That leaves you with such a gut punch that it's the perfect stopping point for the first film.
With only a few months before The Fellowship of the Ring was due in theaters, New Line was eager to see a cut.
I think the first screening was in July of 2001.
And after the lights came up in the room, there was only one thing New Line CEO Bob Shea could do.
Bob is an emotional guy, and he cried. He went into the restroom and cried. I can't say if it was a cry of relief or a cry of excitement and appreciation.
It was good news for Peter and the team.
They were all excited and celebrating that they had just gotten the first cut approved by the studio.
But it was only a momentary victory.
There still was a lot of work to be done because there was a lot of green screen.
We were supposed to lock the film in August, and we didn't quite make it.
To make the tight deadline even worse,
Peter was recording with the London Philharmonic at the end of August.
So once again, they had to pivot and think outside the box. And when Peter flew to London to work with composer Howard Shore,
we had to set up an editing room in London to continue editing.
Thankfully, the score put the finishing touch on many of the scenes.
Oh, Howard Shore's score was fantastic. I was so pleased. Big score for the battle scenes and so on. I thought he did a fantastic job. I think his theme for Hobbiton from the beginning of the film is something that stuck in people's heads immediately, and I can still hear it playing in my head now if I try. I think it was an integral part of the story.
But just as the score was wrapped up,
we were in the cutting room and someone came in and said, well, you should come out and watch this TV. There's something weird going on.
It was the morning of September the 11th.
And there on live TV right in front of us as we walked into the room, the second plane hit the tower.
With all flights grounded, they soon realized they'd be staying in London indefinitely. Meanwhile, new problems suddenly emerged.
I knew we had ratings issues that we were concerned about.
They have a cave troll. The MPAA was concerned with the amount of blood in the mines of Moria Sea.
But we successfully argued that it's mostly orc blood and it's all black, not red. So it's not as frightening to people.
Thankfully, there were no orcs in the MPAA.
We basically got our rating. We had to make a few changes, minor changes.
But even the most minor of changes had New Line concerned.
It was a lot of work. I mean, the deadlines, everything was so tight, so tight.
I think they were probably anxious right through to the end, really, until the film opened. I'm sure they were anxious.
The Fellowship of the Ring premiered in J.R.R. Tolkien's homeland on December the 10th, 2001.
The first premiere we did in London, and we did a huge event there. And then we had a huge screening in Leicester Square.
Few could deny that Tolkien's Magic Kingdom now had a definitive look. It was as good as official.
What blew us away and what everybody was saying when we came out was that's exactly what we'd seen in our minds when we read the book. That was Middle-earth, that was Lord of the Rings. It just seemed right. It just seemed like, yeah, that's what it should be.
I've never experienced anything like that before. When the film started opening, the numbers that were coming in from every single country around the world, that people were just shocked. All I can say is from the film we saw in July of 2001 to the finished film and what Peter did, he's a master filmmaker. I mean, it was just unbelievable.
I remember going to midnight screenings of it. Like, it was intense.
If you want him, come and claim him.
With all the wonderful things I'd heard, even with all the rumors, and I still walked in and I don't think I closed my mouth for the entire film. It's exactly what I'd envisioned in my head.
As the film rippled around the world, it became clear the Fellowship of the Ring had not only redefined Tolkien on screen, but had taken his work mainstream.
After the Ralph Bakshi movie in 1978, it was really still very much a subculture. Like, you couldn't make a Lord of the Rings reference.
One ring to bring them all.
And not be flagged as a nerd, or just have no one understand what you're referring to.
That was now a thing of the past.
One ring to rule them all.
But perhaps the film's greatest achievement was something no one saw coming.
Lord of the Rings had an emotional note that even if you were a Lord of the Rings fan, I don't think you could have predicted the way it just pierced pop consciousness. It wasn't just big, it was massive.
For the first time, fantasy was cool.
Fantasy was thought of by everybody that it was a genre that very few women were interested in, and that was proven utterly and completely wrong. And that, like that, doubled the size of the audience.
Lord of the Rings also happened to arrive just as fandom was searching for a new cinematic dynasty.
Star Wars had been nothing but divisive when it came out in 1999.
Lisa called Jar Jar Binks.
It had broken fandom to a large degree. Lord of the Rings was the opposite, and it really opened the door for a lot of people.
The film also put New Zealand on the map. Now Middle-earth, no longer middle of the road.
We've gone from this little sort of tiny island backwater to the centre of Hollywood, and just really gave everyone a sense of pride and, oh, wow, we can do this. We can kick it with the big boys.
Proof of that came at the 74th Academy Awards.
And the Oscar goes to...
And the Oscar goes to...
Goes to... The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring.
The Fellowship collected 4 Oscars. The success of the first film ensured the biggest project in movie history could fly. Now it was a question of how high and how far.
Where do you go from making that kind of art at that level? Where do you go from there? There's only up or there's only sideways.
Whether the trilogy would go sideways or even backwards would depend on more than just a vision.
The first movie obviously set a platform, but then in the back of our minds we potentially were always going, will 2 and 3 be as well received?
That would depend in part on technology.
There's got to be another way to do this.
The only problem was, it didn't exist yet.
New Line was worried about Weta, about their capacity to deliver.
And the people who needed to create it had their own problems.
I found out that there was a lot of dysfunction at Weta.